Dean Martin struck the match without hesitation. The flame danced in the dim light of the private room at the Sands Hotel, casting shadows across the faces of six of the most dangerous men in Las Vegas. $100,000 in crisp $100 bills sat in a pile on the mahogany table in front of him. Casino money, mob money, money that belonged to men who killed people for far less than what Dean was about to do. He touched the flame to the corner of the first bill and watched it catch fire. "Dean, don't," someone said, but it was too late. The money was burning, and Dean Martin was smiling that famous, unshakable smile. What happened in the 10 minutes after that match was struck would change Las Vegas forever and cement Dean Martin's reputation as either the bravest or the craziest man to ever work the strip. Depending on who you asked, the answer was probably both. The setup, Las Vegas, 1966. To understand why Dean Martin burned $100,000 in front of Mafia, you need to understand what Las Vegas was in 1966. This wasn't the corporate, sanitized Vegas of today, with its family shows and carefully managed image. This was Mob Vegas, where every major casino was connected to organized crime, where bodies disappeared into the desert, and where the real power had nothing to do with elected officials or business licenses. The Sand Hotel was the crown jewel of this empire. Partially owned by crime families from Chicago, New York, and Cleveland, it was where the Rat Pack performed, where high rollers gambled millions, and where the real business of Las Vegas was conducted in private rooms far from the gaming floor. Dean Martin was a fixture at the Sands. After Frank Sinatra, he was their biggest draw, packing the Copa room night after night with tourists and locals who wanted to see the king of cool in person. But Dean's relationship with the Sands and its mob backers was complicated. He wasn't owned by them the way some performers were. He didn't take orders. He didn't bow and scrape. Just a year earlier, in June 1965, he'd faced down Vincent Antonelli, one of the most feared enforcers in Nevada, refusing to meet with him and ultimately earning the mobster's respect through sheer audacity. That incident had established Dean as someone different, someone who couldn't be pushed around the usual way. But respect in the mob world was a fragile thing. It had to be maintained, constantly reasserted. And in February 1966, Dean's respect was about to be tested in a way that nobody, including Dean himself, could have predicted. Dean Martin's philosophy: money, power, and self-respect. Dean Martin grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, a steel town where the line between legitimate business and organized crime was practically invisible. His father, Gaetano Crocetti, worked in a barbershop that doubled as a front for illegal gambling operations. Young Dino Crocetti, as he was known then, delivered bootleg liquor as a teenager, dealt cards in backroom poker games, and learned early that money and power were the currencies that mattered in the world he inhabited. But Dean learned something else too, something that would define his entire career and his approach to dealing with dangerous men. Self-respect was worth more than money, and the moment you valued money over self-respect, you became someone else's property. This philosophy served him well in Hollywood. While other performers scrambled for roles and took whatever deal was offered, Dean walked away from bad contracts, turned down movies he didn't want to make, and generally acted like someone who didn't need show business as much as show business needed him. It drove studio executives crazy, but it worked. Dean became one of the highest paid entertainers in the world precisely because he acted like he didn't care about the money. The same approach worked in Las Vegas. The mob respected strength. They respected people who didn't show fear. Most entertainers who worked Vegas in the 1960s understood that they were employees of men who could have them killed without consequence. They were grateful for the opportunity. They didn't make waves, and they certainly didn't challenge the authority of the people who really ran the town. Dean Martin was different. He performed at the Sands because he wanted to, not because he had to. He had movie deals, recording contracts, and television opportunities that made him independently wealthy. The Sands needed him more than he needed the Sands, and everyone knew it. This dynamic had worked well for Dean, but also created tension. Some of the mob figures who had financial interests in the Sands resented his independence. They resented that he didn't show them the deference they were accustomed to receiving. They resented that he'd faced down Vincent Antonelli and come out ahead. And in February 1966, one of those resentful men decided it was time to put Dean Martin in his place. The night before, the high-stakes poker game. The trouble started on February 23, 1966, in a private room on the 4th floor of the Sands Hotel. This was one of the public gaming areas where tourists played blackjack and slot machines. This was a private salon reserved for serious gamblers, the kind of room where the minimum bet could be $50,000, and where casino credit was essentially unlimited for the right people. Dean wasn't supposed to be there. He'd finished his show at 11, had a few drinks with some friends at the bar, and was heading back to his suite when he ran into Jerry Romano, one of the casino hosts. Jerry mentioned that there was a high-stakes poker game happening upstairs, and that some of the players were asking if Dean might want to sit in. Dean loved poker. He was good at it too, having learned the game in those backroom gambling dens in Steubenville. So he said yes. He'd play a few hands, and Jerry led him up to the private salon. The room was thick with cigar smoke when Dean walked in. 6 men were already seated around the table. Dean recognized 5 of them. There was Anthony Big Tony Scarpelli, who had interests in several Vegas casinos and was connected to the Chicago outfit. There was Lou Rothstein, a legitimate businessman who owned a chain of clothing stores, but who everyone knew was laundering money for mob operations. There was Jimmy the Hammer Castellano, whose nickname said everything you needed to know about him. There was Daniel Wexler, a casino executive at the Sands who was clean, but who worked for people who weren't. And there was Tommy Chun, one of the few independent operators in Vegas, a Chinese-American gambling impresario who had somehow managed to stay in business without mob backing. The 6th man Dean didn't recognize. He was younger than the others, probably in his early 30s, with slick back hair and an expensive suit. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, all sharp angles and cold eyes. When Dean walked in, this man looked up, and his expression didn't change at all, which was unusual. Most people, even tough guys, had some kind of reaction when Dean Martin walked into a room. This man looked at Dean the way you might look at a waiter or a bellhop, with complete indifference. "Dean!" Big Tony stood up, smiling broadly. "We were hoping you'd show up. Pull up a chair." Dean nodded to the table and took the empty seat, which happened to be directly across from the young man he didn't recognize. The dealer, a thin man in a bow tie who worked for casino, started shuffling the cards. "Dean know everyone here?" Big Tony asked. "Most everyone," Dean said, accepting a whiskey that had appeared at his elbow. "Let me introduce you," Big Tony said. "This is Carlo Marchetti. He's visiting us from New York. Carlo, this is Dean Martin." Carlo Marchetti didn't extend his hand. He didn't smile. He just nodded slightly and said, "I know who he is." There was something in the way he said it that put everyone at the table on edge. It wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't friendly either. It was dismissive, like Dean was a celebrity novelty rather than a serious person. Dean, who had been dealing with tough guys his entire life, recognized the attitude immediately. This was a man who thought entertainers were beneath him, that singing and telling jokes wasn't real work, and that people who did those things for a living didn't deserve real respect. The game began. They were playing 5-card draw with table stakes, meaning you could only bet what you had in front of you. The minimum buy-in was $10,000. Dean had brought $20,000 in casino chips, which he cashed out from his regular gambling account at the Sands. It was money he could afford to lose, which was his rule for gambling. Never play with money you can't afford to lose. For the first hour, the game was cordial. Conversation flowed easily, mostly about sports and upcoming fights. Dean won some hands, lost some hands, and was generally up about $5,000. Carlo Marchetti played aggressively, raising and re-raising frequently, tried to intimidate the other players. It worked on some of them. Lou Rothstein folded several hands that he probably should have played. Jimmy Castellano got frustrated and started making bad bets, tried to prove he couldn't be pushed around. But it didn't work on Dean. He played his usual game, calm and calculated, folding when he had weak cards and betting when he had strong ones. He didn't let Carlo's aggression affect his decisions, and that seemed to irritate Carlo. Around 1 a.m, a hand came up that changed everything. Dean was dealt 3 kings, a strong hand in 5-card draw. Carlo opened the betting at $2,000. Everyone else folded except Dean, who called, and Tommy Chun, who raised to 5,000. Carlo re-raised to 10,000. Dean called. Tommy folded. It was just Dean and Carlo now. In the draw, Dean kept his 3 kings and discarded 2 cards. Carlo took 1 card, which suggested he was holding either 2 pair or 4 cards to a straight or flush. Carlo bet $20,000. Dean looked at his chips. He had about $30,000 in front of him at this point. A $20,000 bet was serious money, even for him. He studied Carlo's face, looking for tells. Carlo stared back at him with those cold eyes, completely expressionless. 3 kings was a very strong hand. The odds of Carlo having improved to a full house, straight, or flush with a 1-card draw were relatively low. Dean pushed $20,000 worth of chips into the pot. "Call," he said. Carlo smiled for the first time that evening. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Raise," he said. "Another $30,000. That was a problem. Dean only had $10,000 in chips left in front of him. Under normal circumstances, that would mean Carlo's raise would create a side pot, and Dean could only win the amount he could match. But this was a private game with different rules. If Dean wanted to stay in the hand, he could request casino credit to cover the bet. Everyone at the table was watching. This wasn't just about poker anymore. This was about something else. Carlo was testing Dean, trying to embarrass him, trying to force him to either fold a strong hand or go into debt to the casino to stay in the hand. Dean looked at his cards one more time. 3 kings. He was almost certainly ahead. But did he want to go into debt over a poker hand? "I'll need credit to call that," Dean said to the dealer. The dealer looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Martin, I'll need approval from the floor manager for that amount." "Then get approval," Carlo said sharply, "unless Mr. Martin wants to fold." Dean said nothing. He just sipped his whiskey and waited while the dealer made a phone call. 5 minutes later, Daniel Wexler, the casino executive who had been playing earlier but had since busted out and was watching the game, returned to the room. "Dean, you want to take $30,000 in credit?" Wexler asked. "20,000. Dean corrected. "I've got 10 here." Wexler nodded. "Done." He signed a chit, and the dealer counted out $20,000 in chips and pushed them to Dean. Dean pushed the $30,000 into the pot. "Call." Carlo flipped his cards. He had a flush hearts. "King high." Dean showed his 3 kings. 3 of a kind. The flush beat 3 of a kind. Carlo Marchetti dragged in a pot worth approximately $120,000. He stacked his chips carefully, still wearing that unpleasant smile. "Better luck next time, Singer," he said to Dean. The table went quiet. Singer wasn't said with any friendliness. It was said like an insult, like Dean's profession was something contemptible. Dean looked at Carlo for a long moment. Then he stood up. "I think I'm done for the night, gentlemen." "Congratulations on the hand, Carlo." He started to walk away, but Carlo's voice stopped him. "Where are you going? You owe the house $20,000. "I'm aware," Dean said. "I'll settle it tomorrow." "You'll settle it now," Carlo said. "We don't extend credit to people who walk away from the table." Dean turned around slowly. Everyone in the room could feel the temperature drop. Big Tony shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even Jimmy the Hammer Castellano, who was used to confrontations, looked nervous. "I just said I'll sell it tomorrow," Dean said calmly. "My credit is good at the Sands. Ask Daniel." "I don't care if your credit is good," Carlo said, standing up now. "I don't care if you're Dean Martin or Frank Sinatra or the Pope. You don't walk away from this table owing money." Dean studied the younger man. He understood now what this was really about. Carlo Marchetti had come to this game specifically to humiliate him, to put him in his place, to remind everyone that entertainers were employees and that the real power belonged to men like Carlo. The poker hand had been a setup, or at the very least, Carlo had seen an opportunity and seized it. "Tell you what," Dean said, "I'll write you a personal check right now for $20,000. How's that?" "I don't want your check," Carlo said. "I want to see you settle your debt. Cash. Right now." "I don't carry $20,000 in cash," Dean said. "Then maybe you shouldn't be playing games as big." Carlo said. He was enjoying this now, humiliating Dean in front of the others. Maybe you should stick to performing for tourists. That's when Dean Martin made a decision that would become legend. The $100,000 burning. What really happened? Dean looked at Carlo Marchetti for a long moment. Then he turned to Daniel Wexler. Daniel, I need you to do me a favor. What's that, Dean? Wexler asked nervously. I need you to bring me $100,000 in cash. Hundreds from the casino cage. Everyone in the room froze. $100,000 was an enormous sum in 1966. It would be worth over $1 million in today's money. Dean, I don't think... Wexler started. I'm not asking, Dean said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it now. Bring me $100,000. Now. Wexler looked at Big Tony, who nodded slightly. Do it, Big Tony said. Wexler left the room. The remaining men sat in uncomfortable silence. Carlo had stopped smiling. He couldn't quite figure out what Dean was planning, but he knew something was happening. 15 minutes later, Wexler returned with 2 security guards and a metal case. He opened on the table. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, neatly organized. $100,000 in cash. Count out, Dean said. On the table, Wexler and the dealer count out $100,000 in $100 bills. It made an impressive pile on the mahogany table, a monument to money and excess. Dean looked at Carlo. You wanted to see me settle my debt in cash. You wanted to remind everyone here that I'm just an employee, just a singer who should know his place. Is that about right? Carlo said nothing, but his jaw was tight. Here's the thing, Carlo, Dean said, his voice conversational. I don't actually care about money. I've got more money than I'll ever spend. I make it faster than I can count it. And I sure as hell don't care enough about money to let some punk from New York use it to embarrass me. He pulled out his cigarette lighter. It was silver, engraved with his initials. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to show everyone in this room exactly how much this money means to me. He flicked the lighter and held the flame to the corner of a $100 bill. It caught immediately, the paper crinkling and blackening as fire consumed it. Dean, what the hell are you doing? Big Tony said, standing up. Dean dropped the burning bill onto the pile of cash. It caught on the bills beneath it, and suddenly there was a small fire burning on the table, feeding on $100 bills. Stop him, someone shouted, but Dean was already dropping another lit bill onto the pile. The fire grew bigger. The smell of burning paper and ink filled the room. Carlo Marchetti stood there frozen, watching $100,000 burn. Everyone in the room was paralyzed, unable to process what they were seeing. Nobody burned money, especially not money that belonged to the casino, especially not in front of mob guys. It was crazy. It was suicidal. Dean just stood there calmly, watching the money burn. The flames reflected in his eyes. He wasn't smiling now. He was deadly serious. Jesus Christ, put out! Wexler yelled. One of the security guards grabbed a pitcher of water from bar and threw it on the burning pile. The fire went out with a hiss, leaving a soggy, charred mess on the mahogany table. The room filled with smoke. When the smoke cleared, everyone could see the damage. Approximately $60,000 in cash was completely destroyed, burned to ashes. Another $20,000 was partially burned, unusable. About $20,000 in bills had survived, waterlogged but intact. Dean calmly picked up the $20,000 in surviving bills and counted them out. Then he walked over to Carlo Marchetti and dropped $20,000 in wet, smoke-damaged cash on the table in front of him. There's your debt, Dean said. Paid in full, in cash, just like you wanted. Carlo stared at the money, then at Dean. His face was pale. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Dean turned to the rest of the room. Gentlemen, I apologize for the mess. Daniel, add the destroyed cash to my account. I'll settle it tomorrow along with the poker debt. He looked back at Carlo. Unless there's anyone else here who want to question my credit. Nobody said a word. Dean walked out of the room. The door closed behind him, and for several seconds, nobody moved. Then Big Tony started laughing. It was a deep, genuine laugh, The kind that builds from a belly. That crazy son of a bitch, Big Tony said, shaking his head. He actually burned it. He burned $80,000 just to make a point. Carlo Marchetti still hadn't moved. He was staring at the charred remains on the table, trying to understand what had just happened. You made a mistake, Carlo, Big Tony said, his laughter fading. You tried to embarrass Dean Martin over money. You thought you could make him bow. But Dean doesn't bow. He never has. And now everyone in Vegas is going to know that you're the guy who got shown up so bad that Dean Martin burned $80,000 rather than give you the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. The 10 minutes after, what happened next? The story of what happened in the 10 minutes after Dean left that room comes from multiple sources, all of whom were present. Big Tony Scarpelli told his version. Daniel Wexler told his. Even Carlo Marchetti, years later, told people what happened, though his version painted himself in a slightly better light than the others' versions did. After Dean left, the remaining men in the room sat in shocked silence for about 30 seconds. Then everyone started talking at once. Wexler was panicking about how to explain the destroyed cash to his superiors. The security guards were trying to clean up the soggy, burned mess on the table. Jimmy Castellano was laughing so hard he could barely breathe, but Carlo Marchetti wasn't laughing. He was standing there staring at the door Dean had walked through, his hands clenched into fists. That was disrespectful, Carlo said quietly. Disrespectful? Big Tony turned to look at him. You're the one who disrespected him. You called him singer like it was an insult. You tried to embarrass him in front of everyone. What did you think was going to happen? He burned casino money, Carlo said. That's mob money. He can't. He can, and he did, Big Tony interrupted. And you know what? I respect him for it. That took balls. More balls than you got, that's for damn sure. Carlo's face flushed red. You're going to let him get away with that? Get away with what? Big Tony said. He settled his debt. He said he'll pay for the destroyed cash. What do you want me to do? Have him killed because he made you look stupid? The room went very quiet at that. When Big Tony mentioned having someone killed, even as a rhetorical question, people paid attention. Big Tony had that authority. Carlo seemed to realize he'd overplayed his hand. I'm just saying, there should be consequences. There will be consequences, Big Tony said. The consequence is that tomorrow morning, every connected guy in Vegas is going to hear about how Dean Martin burned 80 grand to avoid giving Carlo Marchetti the satisfaction of seeing him squirm. The consequence is that you're going to be a joke, Carlo. And Dean Martin's going to be more of a legend than he already is. Big Tony stood up and walked over Carlo. He wasn't a tall man, but he had presence. Let me explain something to you. You're young. You don't understand how things work out here yet. In New York, you can push entertainers around. They're nothing. But here, guys like Dean, like Frank, they're worth more to us than soldiers. They bring in millions of dollars. They make this place legitimate. They're why movie stars and senators come to Vegas. So, when a guy like Dean decides to burn $80,000 rather than let you embarrass him, you don't go crying to your bosses. You learn from it. Learn what? Carlo asked. Learn that some people can't be bought and can't be intimidated, Big Tony said. And learn to recognize those people before you try to push them around. Carlo left the room shortly after that, according to multiple accounts. He left Las Vegas the next day and never came back. His bosses in New York had heard about the incident by morning, and they were not pleased. Carlo had come to Vegas to establish himself, to show he was tough. Instead, he'd been humiliated by a singer. In the mob world, reputation was everything. Carlo's reputation was now damaged, perhaps irreparably. Meanwhile, Dean Martin went back to his suite at the Sands and poured himself a drink. His assistant, Jackie Romano, had heard about the incident within minutes from one of the security guards and came rushing to Dean's room. Dean, what were you thinking? Jackie asked, his voice high with panic. Do you know what you just did? I burned some money, Dean said calmly, sipping his drink. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal? You burned mob money. They're going to kill you. Dean shook his head. No, they're not. They're going to respect me. There's a difference. How do you know that? Because I know these guys, Dean said. They respect strength. They respect people who won't back down. That little punk Carlo thought he could push me around because I'm an entertainer. He thought entertainers were scared of them. So I showed him that I'm not scared of anything, least of all money. But $80,000, Dean. Jackie, listen to me, Dean said, and his voice was serious now. If I had backed down tonight, if I had looked nervous or apologized or tried to smooth things over, I would have been finished in this town. They would have owned me. Every time some connected guy wanted something, they'd snap their fingers and I'd come running. But now they know I don't care about money more than I care about self-respect. And that's the most valuable lesson $80,000 can buy. Jackie sat down heavily. You're crazy. You know that. Dean smiled. Maybe, but I'm free. And I'm going to stay free. The next morning, Dean went to Daniel Wexler's office and wrote a check for $80,000 to cover the destroyed cash. Wexler was still nervous, expecting Dean to try to get out of paying. But Dean didn't even question it. You need anything else from me? Dean asked after handing over the check. No, Dean, we're good, Wexler said. But I have to ask, why did you do it? You could have just walked away, settled the debt tomorrow like you said. Dean thought about it for a moment, because that kid needed to learn something, and everyone else in that room needed to see it. I'm not a casino employee. I'm not a mob asset. I'm Dean Martin, and nobody owns Dean Martin. The ripple effects through Vegas. Word of the incident spread through Las Vegas with incredible speed. By noon the next day, every casino employee, every performer, and every connected guy in town had heard some version of the story. The details varied. Some versions had Dean burning twice as much money. Others had him getting into a physical confrontation with Carlo. But the core truth remained. Dean Martin had lit $80,000 on fire rather than be disrespected by a mobster. The story reached Frank Sinatra in Los Angeles that afternoon. Frank immediately called Dean at the Sands. Please tell me the story I heard is not true, Frank said. What story? Dean asked innocently. The story where you burned 80 grand in front of Big Tony Scarpelli. Oh, that story. Yeah, that one's true. Frank was silent for a moment. You know I love you, Dean, but you are absolutely out of your mind. Dean laughed. So I've been told. What were you thinking? I was thinking that I wasn't going to let some New York punk make me look bad in my own town. Dean said, Your town? Since when is Vegas your town? Since I decided it was... Dean said, Frank, you taught me this. You showed all of us how to deal with these guys. You never back down. You never show fear. And you never, ever let them think they own you. Frank sighed. Yeah, but I never burned $80,000 to prove a point. Well, maybe you should have, Dean said. Might have saved you some trouble over the years. The incident changed something fundamental in Las Vegas. Before that night, entertainers were seen as high-paid employees, valued for their drawing power, but ultimately expendable. The mob controlled casinos, and everyone who worked in those casinos, from dealers to headliners, understood that they worked for the mob. But Dean's action challenged that understanding. He demonstrated that a sufficiently valuable, sufficiently fearless performer couldn't be controlled the same way as everyone else. He'd shown that someone with enough talent and enough balls could set their own terms. Other performers in Vegas took note. Sammy Davis Jr., who had always been more careful about mob relationships than Dean or Frank, started pushing back against unreasonable demands from casino owners. Tom Jones, who had just started making a name for himself in Vegas, refused to take a bad contract at the Flamingo, saying if Dean Martin could burn money to prove a point, he could walk away from a lousy deal. The mob figures in Vegas also took note, though their reaction was more nuanced. Some of them, like Big Tony Scarpelli, genuinely respected what Dean had done. They saw it as a display of strength, and strength was something they understood and valued. Others were less pleased, seeing it as a dangerous precedent that could make other entertainers harder to control. But even the ones who didn't like what Dean had done understood that they couldn't retaliate. Dean was too valuable, too popular, and too well-connected. More importantly, he'd called their bluff. If they tried to hurt him or blacklist him, they'd prove his point, that they were bullies who couldn't handle someone standing up to them. So instead, they did something surprising. They gave him more respect. They treated him less like an employee and more like a partner. They asked his opinion on things. They consulted him about which performers to hire for other shows. They treated him, in short, like someone who deserved a seat at the table. The long-term consequences in Dean's legacy. The burning of the money became one of the defining stories of Dean Martin's Las Vegas years. It was mentioned in every profile written about him, every retrospective about the Rat Pack era, every history of Las Vegas in the 1960s. Some people embellished it, adding details that weren't true. Some people questioned whether it really happened at all, whether it was just another Vegas legend. But it did happen. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. The Sands financial records from February 1966 show an $80,000 loss attributed to damaged currency, along with corresponding payment from Dean Martin's account. Daniel Wexler told the story in interviews before he died. Big Tony Scarpelli told it to his grandchildren. Even Carlo Marchetti, in a rare interview in the 1980s, admitted that it happened, though he framed it as Dean having a breakdown rather than making a calculated move. For Dean, the incident reinforced something he'd always believed, that self-respect was more valuable than any amount of money. He'd spent $80,000 to prove that point, and in doing so, he'd secured his independence in Las Vegas for the rest of his career. Nobody tried to push Dean Martin around after that night. Nobody questioned his credit. Nobody tried to tell him what to do or how to behave. In 1967, less than a year after the money-burning incident, Dean signed a new contract with the Sands that made him one of the highest-paid performers in Vegas history. The terms were extraordinarily favorable to him. He had complete creative control over his shows. He could cancel performances without penalty if he wanted to, and he received a percentage of the casino's profits during the weeks he performed. When reporters asked him how he'd managed to negotiate such an incredible deal, Dean just smiled and said, "I guess they wanted me pretty bad." Years later, in a rare candid interview, Dean was asked if he regretted burning $80,000 that night in 1966. He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "Best 80 grand I ever spent," he said. "Bought me something money usually can't buy. Absolute freedom." The interviewer asked him to elaborate, and Dean leaned back in his chair, that famous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Look, in this business, everybody wants a piece of you. Agents, managers, studio heads, casino bosses, mob guys, they all want to control you. They want to tell you what to do, who to be friends with, what projects to take. And most people go along with it because they're scared of losing their career, losing their money, losing everything they've worked for. But here's what I figured out. They only have power over you if you care more about money than you care about being your own man. Once you prove that you'll burn money rather than be controlled, suddenly nobody can control you anymore. So yeah, $80,000 was expensive, but it bought me something I couldn't have gotten any other way." That philosophy defined not just Dean's Vegas years, but his entire approach to life and career. He walked away from a Martin and Lewis partnership when it stopped being fun, even though it was making him rich. He left his television show while it was still successful because he was bored with it. He turned down movie roles that would have paid millions because he didn't want to work that hard. To some people, this seemed like arrogance or laziness. But to Dean, it was simply living according to his values. He'd rather have less money and more freedom than all the money in the world and be someone else's puppet. The money-burning incident also changed how the mob operated in Las Vegas, at least when it came to dealing with major entertainers. After Dean, they were more careful about trying to intimidate or control headline performers. They learned that the biggest stars had enough money and enough options that traditional leverage didn't work on them. You couldn't threaten someone who genuinely didn't care about losing what you could take away. This shift coincided with broader changes in Las Vegas. By the early 1970s, corporate entities were starting to buy out mob-controlled casinos. Howard Hughes purchased several major properties. Legitimate corporations saw the potential profits in Vegas and wanted in. The mob's stranglehold on the city was loosening, and performers like Dean had helped pave the way for that transition by proving that they couldn't be controlled through intimidation alone. Dean continued performing in Las Vegas throughout the 1970s and 1980s, though less frequently as he got older. He was always welcomed with open arms. The casinos knew that Dean Martin could still pack a room, and they knew that he'd earned his independence the hard way. He'd proven that he was willing to sacrifice anything, even a significant amount of money, rather than compromise his dignity. Separating fact from fiction, the truth behind the legend. Over the years, the story of Dean burning the money has been told and retold so many times that it's become difficult to separate the facts from the embellishments. Some versions of the story claim that Dean burned the money in front of hundreds of people in the main casino. Others say he burned $500,000. Still others claim that the mob tried to kill him afterward, and Frank Sinatra had to intervene to save his life. None of those versions are true. The actual incident happened in a private room with only 7 witnesses plus security guards and dealers. The amount was $80,000 in destroyed cash, not $500,000. And there was never any serious attempt on Dean's life. The mob figures who witnessed the incident either respected it or were too pragmatic to retaliate against someone so valuable. But the fact that the story has grown in the telling actually speaks to its power. It resonated with people because it represented something they wanted to believe. That you could stand up to powerful, dangerous men and win through sheer force of personality and courage. That money wasn't everything. That dignity and self-respect were worth fighting for, even at great cost. Dean himself contributed to the mythology. When people asked him about the incident in later years, he never gave the same answer twice. Sometimes he said it happened exactly as reported. Sometimes he said the reports were exaggerated. Sometimes he changed details, the amount of money, who was present, what was said. He seemed to enjoy keeping people guessing, never quite confirming or denying the various versions that circulated. But the core story remained consistent. Dean Martin had burned a significant amount of money, rather than be disrespected by a mobster. And whether the exact amount was $80,000 or some other figure, whether there were 6 witnesses or 16, the fundamental truth was the same. Dean had been willing to destroy cash rather than be controlled. Why this story still matters. The story of Dean Martin burning money in front of the Mafia continues to fascinate people more than 50 years later because it speaks to something universal in human nature. The desire to be free, to be in control of our own lives, to not be pushed around by people with more power or money or connections. Most people can't burn $80,000 to make a point. Most people can't walk away from careers or relationships or opportunities because they don't like the terms. Most people have to make compromises, have to swallow their pride, have to accept being controlled to some degree by forces larger than themselves. That's just reality. But Dean Martin showed that it was possible, at least for some people in some circumstances, to refuse those compromises. He showed that if you were willing to pay the price, and for him, the price was literally $80,000, you could maintain your independence even in a world controlled by dangerous men. There's something inspiring about that, even for people who could never do the same thing. It's the same reason people love stories about anyone who stands up to bullies or refuses to be intimidated by authority. It represents a kind of freedom that most people only dream about. The story also captures a specific moment in Las Vegas history, a time when the city was transitioning from mob control to corporate control, when entertainers were beginning to assert more power and independence, when the old rules were being challenged. Dean's act of burning the money was both a product of that moment and a catalyst of the changes that followed. In the end, the story of Dean Martin burning $100,000 or $80,000 or whatever the exact amount was is a story about values. It's about deciding what matters most to you and being willing to sacrifice everything else to preserve it. For Dean, self-respect mattered more than money. Freedom mattered more than security. Being his own man mattered more than being rich or successful or safe. And on that night in February 1966, he proved it in the most dramatic way possible. He took $80,000 in cash and set it on fire, watching it burn while mobsters and casino executives looked on in shock. It was crazy. It was reckless. It was absolutely perfectly Dean Martin. The match that Dean struck that night didn't just burn money. It burned away the last vestiges of control that anyone thought they had over him. And in the ashes of those bills, Dean Martin's legend was forged, The king of cool who couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened, and couldn't be controlled. What happened in the 10 minutes after he lit that match? The mob learned a lesson they never forgot. Some people are worth more than money. Some people can't be broken with threats or intimidation. And some people, like Dean Martin, would rather burn their fortune than bend their knee. That's a lesson that still resonates today. And that's why, more than 50 years later, people still talk about the night Dean Martin burned $100,000 in front of the Mafia and walked away a free man.